All right. Well, once again, welcome to everybody. We are the Fallbrook Climate Action Team. We're just a group of ordinary citizens who are concerned about our warming planet and its effect on our ability to live good lives on this planet. And we have been doing this for, I think, around 9 years, I guess. We've put together package a speaker once a month, and this time we're doing something a little bit different, by the way. Our speaker is way too busy to talk to just one group at a time, so we have her via recording. She has authorized that. And instead of having Q&A at the end, we're going to have time for discussion. So if you have questions and you can't hold them until the end, go ahead and type them into the chat and we'll return to them. And we'll get started in just a minute. But first of all, I've been asked to remind you that we are a volunteer organization and we're always in search of volunteers. And in particular, we would like to have some people who would make, calls from our sign up list to remind people to show up and so that they will know that they have lost something in their email that they should have signed up for. Okay, so our speaker tonight is Katherine Hayhoe. She is Dr. Katherine Hayhoe. She's originally a Canadian climate scientist. Now she's working in Texas, out of Austin, Texas. And let me see, I've got my lighting dimmed. Let's see if I can read this here. If you'd like to know more about her credentials and her current projects, I invite you to go to her website, drkatherinehayhoe.com. What she tends to do is she refines and focuses climate data and the science so that it can be used for specific purposes, like it can be used for geopolitical regions to make their planning, for agriculture, for cities, and for business. I wanted to provide a quote that I saw on her website that I think kind of sums up her thinking. She's quoting another doctor, Dr. John Holdren, who worked in the Obama administration, who said, "We basically have three choices: mitigation, adaptation, or suffering. We're going to get some of each." Oh, this is hard to see. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more we mitigate, the less adaptation will be required and the less suffering there will be. So Dr. Hayhoe takes that seriously. And so she is all over the place: YouTube, PBS, digital programming, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's enough about her for now. If you have any other questions, like I say, go to her website or we'll talk about it afterwards. But are we ready to start showing? We've got two short, a short video and a little bit longer video.
Be changing because God's in control, not us. And even if it is, who cares? The world's going to end anyways. That's what all evangelicals think, right? When we poll people in the United States about whether they think climate is changing because of humans, and if we ask how worried they are about it, it's true. There is one group that ends up at the bottom, and that is white evangelicals. Only 28% of us say that humans are responsible. And curiously, only 45% of white Catholics also agree, compared to 77% of Hispanic Catholics. But don't they have the same Pope? It isn't being Catholic or evangelical that makes us doubt the science. It's something else. What is an evangelical anyways? There are as many definitions for us as there are books in the Bible. So I'm going to go with one I got from a man named Leith Anderson. Leith is a pastor who's also the president of the National Association of Evangelicals in the United States. So he knows his stuff. And this is what he says. Evangelicals are people who take the Bible seriously. Our first clue came from the polls. And now for our second clue, we're going to go to the Bible. If evangelicals take it seriously, what does it have to say about climate change and all that kind of stuff? The first book and the first chapter is Genesis 1. It talks about how humans were made in the image of God. If you ever went to Sunday school, you probably heard that one. But then it tells us why. So that we humans could be responsible for every living thing on the planet. Now, some translations turn that into dominion over the earth. But even so, would we respect someone who had dominion over a company or a nation and ran it into the ground? Of course not. All of us respect wise stewardship when it comes to being in charge of something. And that's what Genesis is talking about. We are stewards or caretakers of the people, animals, plants, and all living things on this planet. Moving forward through the Bible, there's a lot of verses that speak of God's love and care for creation. But there are also a few verses that people pick out and apply out of context to support their point. For example, there's a verse that says there will always be seasons. So people say, well, how can global warming be real if there always will be winter and summer? Well, did you know that seasons are caused by the Earth's orbit around the sun? And humans aren't affecting that yet. So of course there will always be winter and summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. They'll just be warmer. Then there's the verse about how God will never destroy the earth again with a flood. And so people use that to say sea level isn't rising. First of all, it is. Thousands of gauges around the world are pretty clear on that. But second, even if all the ice sheets on Earth melted, there would still be dry land left, just not nearly as much. And because so many of us live near the coastlines, it's estimated that about a third of us, that's 2.5 billion people, live on land that would be underwater if the ice sheets melted. But that doesn't mean the Earth will be entirely destroyed. So getting back to the main theme of the Bible, in the New Testament, we learn, for example, of people who had quit their jobs and were waiting around, sitting on their hands for the world to end and Christ to return. The Apostle Paul wrote to those people in the letter to the Thessalonians, and in no uncertain terms told them to work with their hands. In other words, to support their family, and elsewhere to care for the widows and the orphans too. Whether we believe in the end of the world or not, we're not supposed to be sitting around waiting for it, because most of all, throughout the entire Bible, we find verses about love for others, particularly those less fortunate than ourselves. And that, as everyone from Pope Francis to Leith Anderson reminds us, is why we care about a changing climate. Because it disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable, those who, if food prices double, can't afford to feed their families. If sea level rises, have nowhere to go. If water runs out, become refugees far from home. It's crystal clear from both the social science and from the Bible that our objections to the science of climate change have nothing to do with being religiously evangelical. They have everything to do with being politically evangelical. As Galen Carey, a former missionary and now the vice president of the National Association of Evangelicals, says, many evangelicals oppose actions to slow climate change, not on a religious basis, but on a political one, because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. Bishop Ephraim Tendero is the Secretary General of the World Evangelical Alliance, representing 600 million people around the world. He was also an official member of the Philippine delegation to the Paris Climate Conference. And when one evangelical asked Bishop F why he cares about climate change, and then added, "Don't you read the scriptures?" he replied, "Yes, I do read the scriptures, and that's why I care." Thank you for watching Global Weirding. Be sure to go to globalweirdingseries.com every other Wednesday so you don't miss the new episode. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter, and check out our Facebook Live discussion every other Thursday after each new episode at 7 p.m. Central. See you next time.
Well, everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
I obviously forgot to remind you that the thing that makes Dr. Katherine Hayhoe stand out is that she is an evangelical Christian, and she finds no distance between spirituality and science. And she's in a good position to explain why. So we started out with that one, and now we'll get back to the science.
Hi, my name is Katherine Hayhoe. I am a climate scientist, and if you were at the Lausanne Congress last week, you probably saw me speak there. So I'm not going to repeat what I said there, and I know that we have a talk coming up on the theology of caring for people and creation after this. So instead, I'm going to build on what I presented last week and give more of an update of what do we know now. I want to pick up where I left off last week by talking about the fact that we are currently confronting multiple crises of our own making. Through the Industrial Revolution, when we built our entire economy on coal and gas and oil, what we call fossil fuels, when we developed our industry, when we expanded to now 8 billion people on the planet, we did so without any regard to the value of what is going into our economic system and the cost of what is going out of our economic system. In other words, we built an economy that was essentially based on the assumption that we have infinite amounts of resources to go in, and whatever comes out the other end in the terms of pollution or waste does not carry any cost or impact for us. Of course, that's not true. We live on a round planet with 8 billion other people, and that means that not only are our resources finite, but that the outputs of our industrial and our economic systems do have a cost. And the result of that cost is the crises that we confront today. So these crises, to put a name on them, are the pollution crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the climate crisis. Let's talk about each one of these briefly. With the pollution crisis, we've known about pollution for a long time. In fact, the first air pollution legislation was over 700 years ago in England, when King Edward forbade the burning of sea coal when his wife was in residence because of the air pollution it caused. The penalty for that was death. That was the first air quality legislation. But today, of course, we know that pollution is much more pervasive around the world, and we are learning more every day about how it affects us and our bodies. Literally every week, there's a new study coming out showing that the impact of pollution is even greater than we thought. We know now that microplastics are present throughout all of our bodies. We know that what they call forever chemicals are also present in our bodies. And we know that every year, more people die from breathing in just the particulates from burning fossil fuels than have died from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. That's right, since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the total number of people who have died, and any death is a tragedy for any cause, but the total number that have died since the beginning of the pandemic is less than the number who die every year just from breathing in the pollution from burning fossil fuels. We have also learned just over the last few years that having gas stoves inside our homes creates terrible amounts of air pollution that is especially damaging for the lungs of children and for people who have respiratory or breathing problems. We're discovering every day just how bad pollution is for us. And we're never discovering how it's not as bad as we thought. We are always discovering that it is worse than we thought. So that is what is at the cutting edge of what we know about pollution today. Now let's turn to talk about the biodiversity crisis. So often we think that that is simply an issue of nature, not people. And as I spoke about last week, we know that 70% of the number of animals on land have decreased over just the last 50 years. So there's been a huge impact of human expansion on the biodiversity. We hear stories about how insect populations are decreasing, how pollinator populations are decreasing, and how that affects our food. We hear how populations are shifting towards the poles as the world gets warmer. But often we don't put the pieces together. We don't realize that all of the oxygen we breathe comes from trees and kelp and phytoplankton. All of the water we drink gets cleaned by the biosphere. All of the food we eat gets grown in the biosphere, obviously. All of the resources we have come from the biosphere. As I said last week, nature doesn't need us. We were designed to depend on nature for everything that gives us life. So the biodiversity crisis is not only a crisis of creation versus people. We are part of creation, and we are at risk from this crisis as well. Every day, every week, every month, we're learning more about how we depend on nature. And we're also learning more about the services that nature provides to us, whether it's coastal wetlands that protect us from storm surge, as well as mangrove forests that do the same, whether it's the ability of green infrastructure in our cities to protect us from flood or heat. For example, low-income, poor neighborhoods are often much hotter during heat waves, and the biggest reason is because they don't have nature to cool us off and keep us at a lower temperature. So there's the biodiversity crisis, and then there's the climate crisis. And the climate crisis is caused primarily by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil. That is where almost 80% of the climate crisis comes from. We also produce heat-trapping gases from deforestation, from large-scale industrial agriculture, and from food waste. And actually, South Korea is the leading country in the world in terms of reducing food waste. So in terms of what's causing climate change, every year we are discovering more through using satellite data. And what satellites are showing us is that there's old leaking oil wells that are producing huge amounts of methane, a very powerful heat-trapping gas. Satellites are also identifying areas of deforestation, especially illegal logging in many of the world's rainforests, which is also a biodiversity issue as well. So we are still learning more about where all of these carbon pollution emissions are coming from, but we know that humans are the cause. And we've known since the 1800s that, again, digging up coal, gas, and oil produces heat-trapping gases that wrap an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. We've looked at all the natural factors, like the sun and volcanoes and natural cycles. And we know that according to those factors, we should be getting cooler right now, not warmer. Instead, we're warming faster and faster. We know that climate is changing and humans are responsible. So these are the three crises that we confront: the climate, the pollution, and the biodiversity crisis. What else do we know today? Well, we also know that looking backwards into the history of our planet, we know that we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. So it is no exaggeration to say that we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with our only home. And we also know from public opinion surveys around the world that finally people are getting it. When you ask people, are you worried about climate change? The majority of people around the world now say yes. In this map, the gray areas were not surveyed, and any country that is pink means that more than 60% of people are worried about climate change. So most people are worried, and in fact, other surveys have also shown that most people are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. Because although we scientists refer to global temperature as a way to measure how the planet is changing, what you and I experience in our daily lives is not so much global warming in terms of the whole planet getting warmer. We experience it, what I call global weirding. In other words, the weather is getting weirder. So this week, as we speak, there are record-breaking floods in Nepal. Over 100 people have already lost their lives. Towns and villages have been destroyed. And the same thing is happening on the other side of the world. In the United States, in the states of North Carolina and Tennessee, hundreds of people, thousands of people homeless, towns being destroyed by flooding. And that's just this week. The other week, there were record-breaking floods in Europe. There was Typhoon Yagi that led to hundreds of deaths in Vietnam, as well as shutting down Shanghai and hitting Cambodia and Myanmar and other cities in Southeast Asia. Week after week, we are seeing the weather dice getting loaded against us. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, wherever we live, it's as if we have a pair of weather dice. And we always have a chance of rolling a double six, naturally. That's a drought, a heat wave, a flood, a storm. But as the world gets warmer decade by decade, It's like it's sneaking in and replacing 1 6 and then another 6, and then maybe even putting a 7 on our dice. And we say, how can this happen? We're getting too many 6s and we're even getting some 7s. That's global weirding. So what's happening? Well, specifically, we see that the heat wave season is getting longer. There was a terrible heat wave in Asia in April and May this year. So the season is getting longer. The heat waves themselves are getting stronger and they're lasting longer. What else do we see? When there's a drought, we see that that drought is lasting longer and it's much more intense and more dangerous than it used to be. We see that wildfires, especially in my home country of Canada, as well as in other places around Europe and beyond, wildfires are burning greater area. Why? Because when that wildfire starts, whether through accidental human ignition or whether through lightning, because all of the vegetation is hot and dry, that means that it burns much greater area much faster than it would otherwise. We also see that typhoons, cyclones, and hurricanes, those are all the same type of storm. They're just called different names in different parts of the world. We see that these storms are becoming much stronger. Why? Because they are powered by warm ocean water. And remember, I talked about that extra blanket that we're wrapping around the planet. Well, 90% of the heat that's being trapped by that extra blanket is going into the ocean, where it is powering storms that are not more frequent. We do not see more frequent cyclones, typhoons, or hurricanes, but the ones that form are intensifying faster. They are much stronger. They are dumping a lot more rain, and they're much more dangerous. And then we also see an increase in heavy rainfall events and floods not associated with tropical storms as well. Why? Because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, as it always does, there's more water vapor for that storm to pick up and dump on us today than there was 50 or 100 years ago. What else is new? One of the newest areas of climate science is called individual event attribution. What does that mean? It means that 20 years ago, when there was a flood or a heat wave or a storm, and a reporter would call a climate scientist and say, was this climate change? The scientist would say, I said, we all said, the scientist would say, we cannot attribute any one event to a changing climate, but we know that over climate timescales of 20 to 30 years, that these types of heat waves are getting more frequent, or these types of storms are getting stronger, or these types of wildfires are burning more area. That's what we used to say. But now, at the cutting edge of climate science, we are starting to be able to put a number on how much worse climate change made one specific event. So let me give you an example. 7 years ago, there was a very strong hurricane called Hurricane Harvey that hit the state of Texas, where I live. Now, would that hurricane have happened 100 years ago? Yes. Would it have been so strong and so damaging? No. We've calculated that, and when I say we, I mean scientists in general, we've calculated that almost 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have fallen if it were not for human-caused climate change. Then you look at the area flooded. An even greater area flooded because many parts of Houston were ready for 30, 40, even 50 centimeters of rain. But they weren't ready for even more than that. And so the more rain that falls, the greater the area that floods and the greater the damages. And so scientists even calculated that 2/3 to 3/4 of the economic damages due to the storm would not have happened if the same storm had happened 100 years ago. There was a devastating heat wave and wildfire season in June 2021 along the west coast of North America from Canada down into the US. That was 150 times more likely because of a changing climate. The recent European floods, they just happened 2 weeks ago. Scientists have already calculated that they were several times more likely because of a changing climate. That's what I mean by having those weather dice loaded against us. And in some cases, we can even calculate that the event would not have been a disaster if it were not for climate change. For example, in Syria, Iraq, and Iran, they have been in a very, very serious multi-year drought since last summer, not this summer, but the summer before. And as you can see from this figure, research has shown that the current drought, as the world has warmed by 1.2 degrees Celsius so far, the current drought is extreme. Without a changing climate, it would not even have been a drought. It would have been such a small precipitation deficit, such a small lack of rainfall, it wouldn't even have qualified to be a drought. And then, of course, if the world gets warmer by 2 degrees, it would be an exceptional drought. So this is an example of a severe event that wouldn't even be a concern if it were not for climate change loading the weather dice against us. It isn't only the physical science that we've been learning about. We also know much more now about the social science of how humans interact with information. And one of the biggest things that we have learned over the last few years is that when people say, oh, climate isn't changing, or, oh, it's not very serious, or, oh, there's nothing we can do about it, they don't actually have a problem with the science. What they have is a problem with the solutions. They don't think that climate change matters to them, and or they don't understand what we can do about it. So when we argue this over science with people, and I'm a scientist, so I can certainly argue a lot of science, that's not actually addressing the real issues. Most people actually are worried about climate change. As I think about it, it's all up in their head. But we have to help them connect their head with their heart, why it matters to them, and connect their heart with their hands. What do real solutions look like that actually make a difference? So often to do that, people say, well, what we have to do is we have to scare people. We have to show them how scary climate change is. And if they just understood how scary it was, they would do the right thing. Well, if nobody was worried about it, we certainly want people to understand how serious it is. Because why would you want to fix a problem if you don't know that there is one? But as you saw already from this map, most people around the world are already worried. And so the social science has been looking at why aren't people acting when most people are already worried? And it turns out that our brains are not wired to respond long-term out of fear. Now, this is very interesting because if you remember last week, I talked about how my favorite Bible verse is from 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, and it talks about how God has not given us a spirit of fear, but rather a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind. So it's fascinating to me to hear how neuroscientists and social scientists have been discovering that fear alone is not enough to motivate people to act on climate change. Specifically, climate changes and we get worried. And so often we just share more scary information with people. But what happens is, as neuroscientist Tali Sharot says, she says, fear and anxiety will cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. So what we've discovered, what scientists have discovered, is that to help people act, what do we need? We do have to help them connect their head to their heart to understand why it matters. Because again, if we don't know why there's a problem, why would we want to fix it? But once we've done that, we have to help people connect their heart to their hands. What can we do about it? And what does a better future look like? Because neuroscientist Tali Sharot continues, she says, the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not with avoiding harm. So she says, reframe your message. And she's just talking about any message, not climate action. But she says, reframe your message so the information you produce induces hope, not dread. Now, is that not what we're called to do? Are we not called to share hope and love? So this is perfectly aligned, I believe, with who we are. How we talk about these issues should be completely aligned with our identity as children of God, as people who have already had God's love poured out on us. And as it says in the book of Romans, hope begins with suffering, which leads to perseverance, which leads to character, which will not disappoint, because our hope has been placed in what? In the love of God, which has been poured out in our hearts. So it is absolutely fascinating to me again that the social science has been showing that fear is not enough. When we engage people on these issues, on these crises that we confront, it's important to use our sound mind to understand why they're happening. It's important to respond out of love for others, especially those who are most affected by this crisis. We know that we're all impacted by these crises, but we're not impacted equally. Those who are already poor, vulnerable, and marginalized are disproportionately affected. And what's not fair about this is they're the ones who've done the least to cause the problem. But we also need to be responding out of power, the ability to act rather than fear, which paralyzes us. And we believe that God has given us that spirit of power, love, and a sound mind. So the last update I want to give you is the fact that we truly do have good news to share. The more we learn about solutions to the pollution crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the climate crisis, the more we realize that these solutions will lead to a future that is better than what we have today, not worse. These solutions will give us air that is cleaner and water that is safer to drink. They will protect us from disasters like storms, floods, and wildfires. They'll improve our physical and our mental health, give us energy that's more affordable, not less. Solar energy is now the cheapest form of electricity humans have ever known. They will reduce our inequalities, create healthier ecosystems and food systems, give us a world that is better and more stable. So when we look at these solutions, what do they look like? There's no one solution that if everybody did this, it would fix the whole problem. But there's a whole plethora of solutions, a variety of solutions, almost solutions that in their variety and their diversity, they almost mirror the image of all of us as part of a body. There's all different parts of a body that each have their own function. And with solutions to this issue, there's all different parts of the solutions that all have their function. But if I had to categorize them into 3 categories, here's what I would do. I would describe them using a swimming pool. So the swimming pool is the atmosphere, and the level of water in the swimming pool is the level of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we stuck a giant hose in the swimming pool, and we've been turning the hose up every year. So the first category of climate solutions is turning the hose off. What does that look like? It looks like efficiency, not being so wasteful with our energy. The cheapest form of energy we have is the energy we don't use. It also looks like clean energy. It looks like land use and agricultural practices that don't cut down trees, that don't produce heat-trapping gases. Behavioral changes. And for the very few last drops in the hose, the very expensive, energy-intensive, technological solutions like carbon capture and storage. They won't turn off the whole hose for us. They'll just take care of the last few drops. But in addition to that, our pool has a drain, and the drain is nature. When we make the drain bigger, not only do we invest in biodiversity, but we also take that carbon out of the atmosphere where we have too much of it, and we can put it back in soils and ecosystems, grasslands, forests, coastal wetlands, and more, where we want it. What does making the drain bigger look like? First of all, it looks like conserving the resources we already have, protecting the ecosystems we already have because they contain much more carbon than anything we could ever plant. Number 2, restore ecosystems that have become degraded. Number 3, regenerate ecosystems. That's where we actually have to plant things because we've destroyed the nature that used to be there. Then climate smart agriculture can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil where we want it. Like planting cover crops, which are not harvested, they just grow, they take up carbon from the atmosphere as they grow, and then farmers can plow them back into the ground, and they take all that carbon into the soil where it's an incredible fertilizer. And then for the last few drops down the drain, we have the expensive energy-intensive technologies like direct air capture. They can't make the whole drain bigger, but they can help with the last few drops. But there's one more thing we have to do. The level of water in our pool is so high that for many people, their toes don't touch the ground. We have to help people learn how to swim. That is adaptation. We have to help people adapt their infrastructure, their communities. We can work with nature. Again, providing green spaces in cities helps adapt against extreme heat and flooding, as well as restoring biodiversity and taking up carbon. You see what I mean? There's these solutions that are win-win-win solutions. So when people say, well, there's so much to do, where should I start? I say, let's start with the solutions that address multiple issues. Let's start with solutions that give people more water and reduce invasive species and help biodiversity and help them become more climate resilient. Like what? Like taking out all the invasive species from the reservoirs that are taking up the water for Cape Town, a place that is very water short. Or planting trees around agricultural fields that take up carbon but also provide shade and trap water and allow farmers to grow more food rather than less. I already talked about greening urban areas and cities. There's so many solutions that we can implement that are win-win-wins for people and for nature. The more we look at these solutions, the more we think, why aren't we doing them everywhere? And that brings me to my last point. When it comes to climate action, when it comes to acting on pollution and on the biodiversity crisis, what's the number one thing that we can do? How do we get started? Well, remember, I showed you at the beginning this map of how many people are worried about climate change around the world. And then the researchers asked people, do you ever talk about it? And most people said, no. Now, here's the thing. Why does talking matter? It's because how do humans ever do anything together without talking about something? Talking changes who we see ourselves as, what people around us think. It changes our own sense of whether if we do something, will it make a difference? That's what efficacy means. And talking changes our ability and willingness to act. And so the biggest thing that we have learned is that every single person has the most powerful tool possible to catalyze change. And that tool is quite literally our voice. How do I know that one person can make a difference? Because if you look at this map, you'll notice there are some countries that are pink. And I can't tell you for sure, but I suspect the reason these countries are pink is because of one young woman who just took a piece of white cardboard and painted a few words on it, school strike for climate, and went and sat outside a building, and that building was the Swedish parliament, and her name is Greta Thunberg. So let me close with these thoughts. A few years ago, when the latest IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report came out, I was asked to write an essay on how do we find hope in the face of such devastating news. And when I looked back at history, I realized that social changes have happened before at the scale that we need them to today. And in those changes, many of the voices involved came from the Christian community. Where do we find hope? I said. We find it in action. The world has changed before, and when it did, it was not because a president, a prime minister, a CEO, or a celebrity decided it had to. Change did not begin with the King of England deciding to end slavery just because it was Friday, or the President of the United States saying, oh, let's just give women the vote, or the National Party of South Africa opting to end apartheid. No, change began when ordinary people of no particular power, wealth, or fame, decided the world could and should be different. We know a few of their names, but most of the names we don't know. Who were these people who shared and supported and fought for a vision of a better world? They were the people who had the courage of their convictions, who used their voices to advocate for the systemic societal changes needed. Who were they? They were us. We are the people who changed the world before, and that means that we are the people who can change it again. Why? Because I'm convinced that caring about God's creation, the people and the other living things that are already being affected by climate change today, it is truly a genuine expression of our faith. It is a faithful acceptance of our responsibility, and it is a true expression of God's love. Because as the Apostle Paul says in the book of Galatians, the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. Thank you.
So we're all back. I see one thing in the chat, and that is Yusuf's contact information. Everybody unmute and let's hear what you had to say.
Well, I'll go first. This is Yusef Miller again. As the co-chair of the Interfaith Coalition for Earth Justice, we have these kind of conversations a lot from various different faith traditions. For example, I'm Muslim, and we also have Catholics and Protestants of various types, and Buddhists and many others. So we look at the idea of being stewards of the earth, and we take that very seriously. So through the years that we've been doing this work, trying to outreach to faith centers and bring them all in under this idea that we are, in all of our faith traditions, we are tasked as the stewards of the planet. We find no contradiction in supporting and standing with our secular brothers and sisters to work on this one planet that we have. I mean, we either work together or perish.
Thank you. So, Dr. Hayhoe is talking from the perspective of an evangelical Christian, but she could have been a Muslim, a Buddhist, anyone. There is no distance, you're saying, and you're finding in your interfaith group, tell us again
Yes.
the name of the group.
Interfaith Coalition for Earth Justice.
Okay, so it doesn't matter where you're coming from a religious standpoint.
Yes, that's right.
I can tell you what really stands out for me when I hear someone working from a positive approach, which is that she kept saying it's win-win. All the solutions are a win-win. So like, who wouldn't want to have cheap energy? Who wouldn't want to have, a green planet? Who wouldn't want to have cheaper food? Who wouldn't want to have food stability? I think, as she said, we need to approach people from a position of power and a position of hope. And bottom line is, we have nothing to lose by enacting the things we need to do to bend the curve on this thing, and so much to win. Is that we'll have a better planet, not a less good planet. And I think that's kind of the approach that we need to take.
Well, having some experience with a couple of ex-friends who purportedly were from the religious community, and their take on everything that's going on relative to climate change, which they basically refute. It really does come down to that social connection that they share with a lot of other people, where it's really a more political persuasion. It's more of a political point of view that everything else fans out from that. So I think there's a certain portion of individuals, I'm not saying necessarily just in the religious realm, not at all, secular too, that are not reachable. And I think that it's a situation where we have to find common ground with those who are at least willing to, listen. And that's pretty challenging, but bringing a lot of the information that was shown in the video and sharing that, for example, with this individual that I'm referring to, really wouldn't matter, because they have their own tunnel vision of what's going on, and that everything is, all the solutions politically motivated and in the wrong way. And so that has always been kind of a challenge as far as finding the people who are willing to listen, in my view.
I hear what you're saying, but I don't think we need to convince people of anything. I don't think we need to not so much to not get behind, digging up more fossil fuels or all the things that we're doing that are wrong, but basically to promote the things that would be beneficial to them. Like these people want cheaper energy as well. They also want
That's good.
cleaner air. We take it issue by issue. And so they can act in a way that's not consistent with the whole political agenda that they've attached themselves to, and in a way that promotes the well-being of everybody, issue by issue. Do you or do you not want to save this wetlands, outside your house? Well, yeah, I like that just because it's a nice wetlands, and it would be nice to keep the water out next hurricane. All of these things people like. I think that's.
I think that knowledge is power, or power is knowledge. In other words, I think there are a lot of people who say reject the idea that humans can change the climate for the better because we're the ones that change it for the worse. And people don't believe that they can do anything about changing the climate for the better, and therefore they tend to be denialists and say, well, we can't change it for the better because it wasn't our fault that it became this way in the first place. But if people realize that they do have the power to improve things, then they'll work towards improving the climate if they know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Leslie Gomez, and I'm a board member of the North County Climate Change Alliance, and I'm also involved with the Climate Action Task Force at the Unitarian Fellowship in Solana Beach. And we have several things going on where we're trying to help educate people what they can do to live with less fossil fuels. And I think one of the things that I'm finding a lot of positive response to is we will occasionally have potlucks at the fellowship that are vegan. And we have been trying to encourage people to eat vegan to help reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we get from animal agriculture. And so we have various discussions about climate change. I've been on the active with the San Diego Building Electrification Coalition. My home is all electric. I have solar. I drive an electric car, and I do everything I can to reduce my carbon footprint and feel good about it.
That's great. And you're talking to people who are open to your idea too.
Yes.
The thing that Dr. Hayhoe didn't talk about very much, but I've heard a lot about from other sources, is that one of the things that we can all do, and which would make actually a noticeable difference, is we can waste less food.
Yeah.
And we can make sure that, whatever food we have excess is handled properly. And that's within all of our power. You don't put your leftover casserole down the garbage disposal. No, we have, you can put it in the green waste now.
Yeah.
We have all these things that we can do. Maybe we won't buy more food than we think we can eat in a week before it spoils. But bottom line is, if we are putting less stuff in the water and in the landfill, we'll be contributing a lot less methane and heat gases out there, and we can all do it. And why wouldn't we? And you don't have to be able to afford solar or an electric car to do that.
I think Leslie Batson has something to say.
You should unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just unmuted. We should not ignore the political side of this, which is extremely fraught, in my opinion. The new administration, drill baby drill, reverses the previous administration that was really working hard on incentivizing electric cars, for instance, by having more charging stations, making them more useful in that way, and with more to come, maybe. Secondly, we should not forget the invasion of Crimea by Russia and the sanctions that went on after that. One of the sanctions was from the United States is we prevented Exxon Mobil, the only company in the world that could successfully deal with Arctic conditions. I'm not sure the technical reason of this, from assisting Russia of developing its huge gas and petroleum resources in the Arctic. And so they were very upset with that. Mr. Putin was very upset with sanctions. And when the present president was still thinking about running, in 2015, he had his first conference and was asked the first question by Maria Butina, which turned out to be a Russian spy. Would he, as president, drop sanctions? Oh, sure, I'll drop sanctions. Well, that was very important. And so he appointed Rex Tillerson, if you remember, from ExxonMobil as Secretary of State to signal to the Russians how anxious he was to help them. I think that's my interpretation. He didn't get there, thank goodness. But now he is going to get there. And sanctions, 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 says Putin. And you know it'll get a favorable response by Putin if we as a world start pumping oil and gas from the Arctic. We add huge amounts of greenhouse gases, just absolutely huge amounts. So keep our eye on the politics.
Well, what can we do to stop this from happening?
I have no
Yes.
idea. At this time, we seem to have a tidal wave of stupid ideas rolling over this country, and it's the same subset. What do you do? What do you do? I can't answer it.
I'm going to go back to
This
what
is-
Dr. Hayhoe said, which is use our voices, and that we've turned the boat of culture around in the past, and that's how we did it.
Well, that was a really good thing she said. We can just talk about it. You know, what do you think about ending sanctions in Russia? I don't know. What's that all about? Well, it's about releasing the oil and gas in Siberia and Russia through the use of the only company that has the technology to be able to do that.
This is Scotty Lloyd. I just, if I may jump in, Catherine mentioned win-win situations, which is a sense of love as versus fear. Politicians generally use fear, regardless of what party they come from, because once you've got a challenge, they have an answer, and therefore they'll become the savior of the moment, and that's what generates votes. And again, regardless of whether it comes, what party it comes from. And I think Catherine did a very good job in showing the fact that love denotes a win-win situation. And she took that back to the individual, the power of the individual. It took the power of voting. When you look at the political situation, enough people voted one direction or another. And whether you're on the side who think likes what's happening or does not like what's happening, point is, it was the power of an individual who voted. And the same is true with fighting pollution, with greening of the world and so forth. And that is, it starts with the individual. It starts with each and every one of us, I think, in how we approach things, and then begin to communicate that, as she mentioned, in talking to others and sharing that with others. It may sound rather small and even weak compared to some of the actions that have been going on over the last 30 days. But in fact, the collective nature of that is what finally creates a tidal wave of change. good or bad, throughout human history. So as small and as it may sound, we the people, which is part of our Constitution, if I remember correctly, she used that term, though she didn't make a relationship to the Constitution. But we the people do have an awful lot of power if we exercise it.
I'd like to add to Scotty's comment about we the people. There is a group, an organization in California titled Climate Action California, and you can look them up on the web. They're an organization, and what they do is they prepare scripts for an application called Climate Action Now, where you can use this this tool to contact your legislature people, and you have pre-written scripts, etc. I had an email from them tonight that they were trying to get our legislature to take on making the big polluters pay. And I was on it, and I wrote my congressman and sent an email off, and that's what we have to do, is we have to stay on top of these actions that are happening and put our voices behind them and support our legislature to make laws and bills that are going to get us out of this disaster.
Leslie, would you like to put a link to that in?
Yeah.
Is there something that you didn't hear that you expected to hear, or that felt off to you, or how do you feel about what Dr. Hayhoe and the rest of us have had to say tonight? Feel the same way. It's hard to have a discussion this way, I know.
Well, I really liked, this is Deanna, I really liked what she had to say, how she said it, and putting a positive spin on it instead of using fear, pointing out what we can do to solve these problems and what the result will be. The earth will be a much better place, and all the things she said. So
My iPad is locked up. Oh,
I don't think that it really needs to be tied to religion, though.
Mm-mm.
You can be an atheist or an agnostic and still be concerned about climate change. And you can still find a reason to try to, do your part to mitigate it.
Definitely agree with you.
That's absolutely true. I was about to say the same. Sorry if I cut you off. But
Okay.
that attitude is absolutely accepted by the Interfaith Coalition for Earth Justice. Sometimes the reverse is not as easy. You wouldn't think so, but that's true. We've asked secular environmental justice activists, secular people to come to churches and explain to churches and things like that, and some of them say no, we won't, because we don't believe in religion. And for us to teach, and I've been told this directly to my face, for us to do this in a church setting or anything would give a wink to religion as if we believe it's true. I'm like, I don't think it would, but I'm not going to force you to give a presentation to 200, 300 people on a Sunday if you don't want to. So they refuse. But in the Interfaith Coalition for Earth Justice, like I mentioned earlier, we work with our secular organizations. For example, SD 350 is secular. It doesn't mean that there's no religious people in it, but it's a secular organization. So we understand the value, because secular or religious is one planet. So this planet is the one that holds all of our bones. So it doesn't really matter. But I have seen it in the reverse where I've been told directly and not just once by organizations saying, no, we don't want to partner with faith leaders in faith organizations.
That's an interesting twist. I think the reason that I wanted to put this out here tonight is if we can remove obstacles from religious people to acting, good. And sometimes, people feel that their religion is an obstacle to their acting or believing that they can act. And I think we've seen that it doesn't have to be. Scotty, did you have something you wanted to throw in on that?
Giving me a lead in or something, huh? No, I fully agree. Having been an Army chaplain for over 30 years, we work with all faith groups and those who have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And bottom line, the motivation to survive, that's a basic human instinct. And in climate change, that hits a very basic human thing of, I want to survive. And you've got to be able to survive before you can take action towards something else. Any battlefield will teach you that. So regardless of whether it's tied to a particular religious belief or not, is immaterial. Everybody wants to survive. Adaptation, I think, was the term that was used. Teach adaptation, I think, was one of the notes I heard this evening. And then secondly, going from that point is then beginning to develop community. Regardless of whether a community is developed around a particular religious belief or it's around just the sense of not only survival, but also a better life, however one wants to define that. I think that's part of the Constitution too, for the pursuit of happiness. Yeah. So there are a lot of mutual commonalities, regardless of what faith or non-faith, or wherever faith may be directed, I should perhaps be more accurately saying. It starts with humanity surviving and improving itself to a better position in life, which means having a different relationship with nature, which was one of the first things that Katherine stated when she talked about the idea of caretaker versus dominion. If you look at the Hebrew word for that in Genesis, it is better defined as stewardship or caretaker. And the fact that in the old King James Version of 1611, they use the term dominion has unfortunately wreaked havoc in regards to how people have dealt with nature.
So we all have a strong instinct to survive. And I think, and tell me I'm wrong, but I think most of us also have a pretty strong will to not hurt other people. And I think that's another reason to act. I think Dr. Hayhoe called that love. You can also call it empathy. But yeah, religion or no religion, we teach 5-year-olds, don't hurt other people. And that's reason enough to act.
Well, and if you're a really good person, maybe you hope to do something so that other people's lives might be better. Not just that you want to harm them, but you want to make things that like better for everybody.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that ultimately we can frame this whole discussion that way. It's like, it's not about, oh, we gotta stop climate change. I think we could turn it around to like, let's make everything better. The same things.
Well, that was, one of her main points there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same things are gonna make everything better and also stop the bad thing.
Mm-hmm. It's a win-win.
So are we about talked out, folks? It's about, it's 7:39, our usual quitting time. Last chance, anybody?
I mean, I have
Is
a
it-
lot I could say. I haven't chimed in yet.
Oh, please do.
I mean, I guess for some context, I've spent my entire life in evangelical Christianity, and my wife and I both work for big evangelical employers. So, like, we're surrounded by the target demographic of her talk every single day. And she framed things the way she did for very, very important, carefully researched and thought about reasons. And I know this probably doesn't make sense to people outside the religious communities that she's like a part of. But if you don't frame things the way that she did through the language of scripture, through the language of faith, faith, hope, love, community, and connecting them with specific theology and scripture and religious language, a lot of these people simply will not listen to you whatsoever. Like, they won't even entertain the conversation to begin with. They'll just dismiss you out of hand because secular sources are simply not credible to them, period, full stop, no exceptions. And so it's not about like what's true and what's not. It's more a question of like, who do I trust and why? And so it's about relationship more than anything. So I think that the way that she framed it is really important. But there's also like a catch-22 there, right? Because as a few people here have already mentioned, sadly, right now, we're living in this trend, over the last few decades, where a lot of conservative religious communities have drifted into alt-right politics and climate denial, which has been very intentional. The oil industry has specifically invested millions of dollars in creating that trend on purpose for profit, like donating to huge evangelical publishers and pastors and nonprofits and stuff to try and like buy their way in to kind of manipulate the message in that direction. So it's not like some accident. These people believe the way they do on purpose for a reason, which is come about intentionally. But like, what do you do with that reality? And as I think it was Bill pointed out, a lot of these people at this point, they don't even believe in reality anymore. They believe in politics. And it's like, whatever Trump says or whatever the conservative pundits say, that's their truth, no matter how insane it is. And so, like, how do you get through to that? And there's a quote from Richard Rohr who said, we don't believe ourselves into a new way of living so much as we live ourselves into a new way of believing. So a lot of times we think we're going to get through to people by changing their beliefs about something, by arguing, by debate, by convincing them. When in reality, if we could get them to change their lifestyle first, they will eventually update their belief system to reflect their lifestyle. And so a lot of the time, the most effective way to get through to these people, in my experience, through many different examples, has been to get them to change their lifestyle in small ways over time. So, like, as a simple example, I have a few super ultra conservative climate denying relatives who I've had conversations about food with. Now, I'm a vegan and I believe in environmentalism, but they don't. But I was able to get them to actually switch to a much more planet friendly diet by talking about it in terms of health and wellness and organic food and regenerative agriculture and like all these kind of things, in terms of how it's going to make them feel and how healthy it's going to make them, and then connecting it with their interest in health food. And like, so finding common ground and then introducing a lifestyle change. And then once they've come around to that, now they might be more open to hearing about the environmental benefits of the thing they're already doing. Or like, for example, my mother-in-law and my sister are both super into organic gardening, which many climate activists will tell you, if we all had organic gardens and we were eating locally produced, grown food made without pesticides and fertilizers, we'd be a lot better off. Well, both of these people are super conservative, climate denying people, but they're not going to tear out their organic garden because Trump took office and the policies changed. I mean, they voted for the guy, but like, they're doing the thing in their personal life that's good for the planet because they found a way it connects with them. So like, for me, I connect with them on that ground. Or like my dad, he's really into cars and he's a ultra MAGA right-wing Trump supporter. But I'm able to talk to him about electric cars and electrification on the grounds of our shared interest in cars and technology. And, for him, it's Tesla and Elon, unfortunately, but you know what I mean? So like the idea is like finding the thing they're already doing, the thing they're already interested in their lifestyle, and then allowing that to form a bridge into the bigger picture belief changes, political changes. Because yeah, if you get into an argument with them, it's going nowhere. They're just going to shut you down and get angry and defensive. And it's just, I've never once convinced someone through arguing to change their beliefs. It's not one time worked, but like getting them to change their lifestyle has worked many, many, many times. So that's just, maybe that's helpful. Be for what you're for, not against what you're against. Give people hope and a vision for positive change that's tactile, that's practical, that they can bite into. Like, that's why she was saying all those things, because it actually works. And yeah, hope and positivity are more effective than fear and arguing.
It is. And absolutely. I'm so glad you spoke up. We didn't cut you off. That's great. And I can tell you also that, neuroscience, behavioral sciences all say the same thing. You have to work from positivity and can do, and negativity is not going to get you there. And certainly facts aren't going to get you there.
Justin, you gave us a lot of wisdom, and arguing with people on the far end of either political spectrum does nothing. I've found that asking a question might be a little more successful. I mean, do you think that God in Genesis says we have the power to destroy the world or something like that? But to be cautious of evangelicals, they are the most vocal and most dedicated of the climate deniers. And I welcomed what this Katherine woman said. I thought she was good.
And Justin's living it.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah. Those are excellent examples that you gave.
Yeah. So, anything else? Dave?
I can say something. I'm a friend of Justin's. Two other good ways to connect with moderates, not just the far right people, but the moderately conservative people, which is a whole lot of the population, is doing conservation work, restoration work, and working with master gardeners and groups like that. Because if you look at the plant hardiness zones that have been published since the oldest of us were born, they were stable for many, many, many decades, and now they're moving radically, right? Where you should plant, if you're planting trees, you want to know, is this tree going to live for 40 years? And it's just a way of introducing genuine science in a way that people understand. And Katherine, I think, who's probably the best teacher I've ever listened to in my life, was talking about how Hispanic Catholics have a different view on this than a lot of white Catholics. And, I was raised in Catholic, and because, they're closer to the land, they're closer to gardening. And gardening is not just a rich lady's avocation. Gardening is how you get your food, right? So, though, in addition to what Justin said, I think these are ways we can get through to people in a very practical way. It's like, okay, I don't know if you guys have been to a nursery lately, but trees are pretty expensive these days, and what trees are you going to invest in your property or your yard, right? And go to the plant hardiness zones, right? So these are good pathways to talk to people. That's it.
This is Scotty. I'm going to be shameless and give a commercial. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Senior Gleaners, San Diego Senior Gleaners. Anybody 55 and over goes out and volunteers to pick fruit that will go to waste. We picked 1,000 pounds of fruit just last Thursday.
Wow.
That went to our food pantries and food bank. But if you're interested, and I actually put some sweat equity in what you're saying. We've got 50 blood orange trees right here in Fallbrook this Thursday morning, and we need volunteers bad. We don't have enough. And it's work, but it will feed more people than you can imagine.
Yeah.
So anyway, if you're interested, give me a call.
Yeah, can you give the info on how to sign up for that?
Yeah, let me
Chat
chat.
box.
Yeah.
There's an organization in Carlsbad that is called Philabelly, and it rotates between different churches and different congregations. So like the Unitarian Fellowship does it usually once a month, about the third or fourth Thursday of the month. And basically the people from the congregation prepare meals, and we go over to the Methodist Church in Encinitas and set up our buffet for the homeless people. And we typically have 75 people show up that we feed. And, having extra fruit from trees and stuff would be, just great to have something like that donated to Philabelly.
And this kind of brings to mind a speaker we're going to have, I think, in April from the Oceanside Green Kitchen, which takes excess food from agriculture, for example, like truckloads of food that would otherwise go to waste, and turns it into, food and education for people in the food business. So I like what you're saying, and more of that coming in a couple of months. So shall we wrap up and let you have an evening, everybody?
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
Thank you, everyone. This was a great discussion. I really
Thank you
appreciate
very much.
involving it.
Thanks for coming, everybody.